The young man laughed. It was loud, sharp, cruel. "Lady," he said, loud enough for the entire pizza shop to hear, "you're holding up the line. Maybe go find a senior center to argue about coupons." People chuckled. Not all of them, but enough. She stood there in front of the counter, no taller than 5 feet, her hands trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from something deeper. Pain, shock, and perhaps a little heartbreak. Her name was Margaret Flynn, 78 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had once taught hundreds of kids how to read, how to stand tall, how to be kind. She had come in for a slice of mushroom and spinach pizza. Nothing more. But the boy behind the counter, 18, maybe 19, had mocked her, dismissed her questions, rolled his eyes when she asked why the senior discount wasn't applied. She'd waited patiently, had asked politely. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. And yet, there she stood, humiliated, until she took one small step forward. "I buried my husband last spring," Margaret said softly. "We used to come here together. Every Friday." The boy blinked. People at the nearby tables began to turn. The clatter of forks ceased. The low hum of conversation vanished into silence. "He loved this place," she continued. "Loved the garlic knots. Said they tasted like the ones his mother made in Brooklyn. He'd always let me have the last one." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was steady. "I came here today," she said, "to feel a little bit of him again." Her words weren't just being heard. They were felt. The air in the room had changed. Thicker, heavier, like everyone suddenly realized they were in the presence of something sacred. "You don't know me," she said, looking right at the boy, who now had his head lowered. "But you spoke to me like I didn't matter, like I was some obstacle in your day." Her gaze swept the room. "I taught English at Roosevelt High for 40 years. I've seen kids come in broken and leave stronger. I've sat beside children whose parents overdosed. I've spent afternoons in detention halls talking teens out of joining gangs. And every single one of them had more heart than what I just saw behind that counter." Silence. A tear rolled down the boy's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I'm not here to shame you," she added gently. "We all have bad days. But I hope, when you have gray in your hair and a slow step in your walk, someone speaks to you like a human being, with dignity." And with that, Margaret turned and walked toward the door. But before her hand touched the handle, a woman at one of the tables stood up. "Ma'am," she said softly, "please stay. I'd like to pay for your meal." A man stood up next. "Add a soda and garlic knots to her order." "On me." Someone else called from the back. "You're always welcome here, Mississippi. Always." Margaret paused. Her lips trembled. She turned slightly and offered a nod, eyes glistening. And the boy behind the counter stepped out. Slowly, humbly. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was cruel. I didn't see you. I didn't listen. But I want to. I really do." She studied him for a long moment, then smiled. It was small, but it was warm. "Then listen," she said. "That's how it starts." She took her seat in the corner booth, the same one she and her husband used to share. Someone brought her a steaming plate. The smell of garlic filled the air. And for a long time, no one spoke. Because sometimes the loudest thing in the world is the silence left by truth. That moment, one elderly woman, one pizza shop, one act of quiet bravery was only the beginning. Because Margaret Flynn, without knowing it, had just reignited a fire long buried in her heart. And that fire was about to change not just her life, but the lives of everyone she touched. Margaret sat quietly in the corner booth, her gaze lost in the swirl of tomato sauce and steam rising from her slice. She didn't eat immediately. She just stared out the window. On the other side of the glass, the world moved as if nothing had happened. Cars honked. People crossed streets. Life went on. But inside that small shop, something had shifted. The boy, Jason, hovered awkwardly near the register, unsure what to do next. His manager had watched the scene unfold from the kitchen doorway, his face pale and unreadable. A woman with 2 toddlers leaned in and whispered something to her husband. Even the soda fountain, which had sputtered noisily moments before, now seemed respectfully silent. Margaret finally took a bite. It was warm, comforting. A flood of memory washed over her Friday nights with Tom, her late husband, laughing about something silly he read in the paper, wiping marinara from his chin with the back of his hand. He used to wink at her after every first bite like it was the best thing he'd tasted that week. She closed her eyes, just for a second. When she opened them, Jason was standing beside her, a small to-go box in his hand. "I know you're probably full," he said quietly, "but my grandma always saved dessert for the people she respected. So, this is from me. Cannoli." Margaret looked at him, really looked. He was just a boy, maybe with too much pride and too little perspective. But there was sincerity in his eyes now, and regret. "Thank you," she said softly. He placed the box gently on the table and turned to walk away. But before he left, she called after him. "Jason." He stopped. "Where's your grandma now?" He hesitated, then said, "She passed last year. Lung cancer. I was angry at everything for a while after that. Still am, I guess." Margaret nodded slowly. "Grief makes fools of us all, but it doesn't have to keep us there." He didn't say anything, just nodded, then walked away. The rest of her meal passed in a sort of sacred quiet. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, every sound, every moment. As she stood to leave, the manager approached. "I'd like to invite you back next week," he said. "Free meal. No strings. Just respect." Margaret smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "I think I'll take you up on that." She stepped outside into the summer air. The sun had dipped lower, casting long golden rays across the sidewalk. The sky had that late afternoon hue blue tinged with something softer, more forgiving. As she walked down the street, her bag of leftovers swinging gently at her side, a small voice inside her whispered, "You still matter." She didn't know where it came from. Maybe Tom, maybe herself. But for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt seen, heard, alive. What she didn't know was that someone at the back table had recorded the entire moment on their phone. And by midnight, her quiet speech in the pizza shop would be seen by over 2 million people online. But that comes later. For now, Margaret just kept walking, towards something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't that she was anxious. It was more like something inside her had been stirred, like sediment rising from the bottom of a long-settled river. Her body ached as it always did, but her mind was buzzing. She got up around 5 a.m., made a pot of weak black coffee, and sat by the kitchen window, staring out at her empty garden. The silence of the morning used to be comforting. Now, it felt different. Charged. Expectant. By noon, her phone rang. She still had a landline. Caller ID flashed. Linda Lee. Her neighbor. A sweet woman who had once taught piano down the block. "Margaret," Linda said breathlessly. "You're all over the internet." Margaret blinked. "The what?" "Someone filmed what happened yesterday. In the pizza shop. It's everywhere. Facebook, Instagram, even Twitter. My grandson said it's called the Pizza Shop Monologue. She laughed, breathless again, "You're viral." Margaret's heart sank a little. "Oh dear," she murmured. "That's not what I wanted." "Well," Linda said gently, "maybe it's what someone else needed." Margaret wasn't sure what to say to that. By that evening, the calls hadn't stopped. First from a local journalist who had seen the video and wanted to feature her in a community column. Then from an ex-student, Maria Sanchez, now a social worker in Queens. Maria had cried on the phone. "You reminded me why I went into this work," she said. "You reminded me of you." Margaret sat in her recliner, surrounded by walls lined with photo frames. Tom's portrait hung near the bookshelf. She stared at it for a long time. "What are you doing to me, Tom?" she whispered. A few days later, Margaret agreed to meet the journalist. His name was Calvin. Young, polite, a bit awkward, but sincere. He came to her house with a notebook, a camera, and eyes that shone with admiration. "I won't take up much of your time," he said. Just a quick profile. Your story struck a nerve. It wasn't a story, Margaret said, pouring him tea. It was just a moment. Exactly, he replied. That's what makes it matter. They sat on her porch. Birds chirped in the hedge. A breeze stirred the wind chimes above. Calvin asked questions, not just about the pizza shop but about her life. Her teaching, her marriage, her time volunteering at the library, the miscarriage she'd never told anyone about except Tom, the student who returned years later to thank her for not giving up on a punk like me. You remember all of that? Calvin asked, amazed. Of course I do, Margaret said. Every face, every name. They mattered. Calvin's article published 3 days later. The Wisdom in the Booth, One Woman's Quiet Revolution. It went national. From there, things moved faster than Margaret could understand. An education nonprofit contacted her. They wanted her to speak at a youth leadership forum. A podcaster invited her to discuss aging and dignity. A group of high schoolers started a hashtag #ListenLikeMargaret and used it to share stories of the elderly in their own lives. It was overwhelming, but also strangely exhilarating. One morning, Margaret stood in front of the mirror. She adjusted the silver chain around her neck. It had been Tom's gift on their 30th anniversary. She hadn't worn it since the funeral. She stared at her reflection. Her eyes were tired, yes, but behind them, something had awakened. A version of herself she hadn't seen in years. Purpose. Not duty. Not routine. Purpose. Jason came by the house one Saturday, unannounced. Nervous. He held a small bouquet of daisies. They're from the farmer's market, he said, sheepishly. Daisies were my mother's favorite, she replied, taking them gently. He shifted his weight awkwardly. I wanted to say thank you. Again. And maybe ask something. She raised an eyebrow. Ask what? Well, he scratched the back of his neck. I've been thinking about my grandma and how you talked about your husband and the way you stood up in front of everyone like that. I don't know. I want to be better. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. Jason blinked. Really? You're already better, she said simply. You're here. They talked for an hour. About grief. About growing up. About the terrifying space between being a boy and becoming a man. She didn't give him advice. Not directly. She told stories. About how Tom had once cried after he couldn't fix the broken fence because his back was too weak. About the student who'd stolen her wallet and later became her friend. About the way people carry invisible battles, always. Jason left with red eyes and a full heart. He came back 2 weeks later, this time with his mother. Her name was Denise. She worked nights cleaning offices. She'd raised Jason alone. She cried when Margaret opened the door. I don't know what you did to him, she said, but thank you. Margaret smiled. I didn't do anything, Denise. I just listened. Denise paused, then added, voice trembling. It's been a long time since someone listened to me too. They had tea. They came back every Sunday after that. One afternoon, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the envelope slightly crinkled. Inside, Mrs. Flynn, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in your class in 1989. You called me out once for laughing at a girl who stuttered. You pulled me aside and said, you don't need to be loud to be noticed. You need to be kind to be remembered. I never forgot that. I work in corrections now. I talk to young men about pain and power and how to break cycles. I quote you often. You were right. Kindness is what survives. Thank you for being my first example. With gratitude. Tyrone M. She folded the letter, held it to her chest, and closed her eyes. Tom's voice echoed in her mind. You planted seeds, Maggie. They're still growing. But not everything was applause and gratitude. One evening, she was invited to speak at a city council event about elder inclusion and respect. She prepared a short speech. Nothing fancy, just honest. When she stood behind the podium, someone from the audience muttered, she's just a sweet old lady. Why is she here? She heard it. Everyone did. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. I am a sweet old lady, she said, and I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the sweetest voices carry the sharpest truth. Laughter erupted. So did applause. But it wasn't about the joke. It was about what she represented. People were listening, not just to her but to every quiet, overlooked voice she stood for. And she knew, as she walked off the stage to a standing ovation, that this was only the middle of the story. Not the end. Not yet. The weeks turned into months. Summer slipped into early fall. The leaves began their quiet transformation just as Margaret had. Once known only to her neighbors and former students, she was now quietly becoming a symbol. Not a celebrity, not a viral gimmick. A voice, an anchor, a reminder. It was never about fame. She turned down the daytime talk shows, politely refused the sponsorship offers, even declined a television producer who wanted to turn her moment into a made-for-TV movie. I'm not a character, she told him. I'm a person, and people aren't sound bites. What she did say yes to, though, was community. She began meeting with small group students, retirees, social workers. She listened. She asked questions. She shared when needed. But mostly, she allowed silence to fill the space when words couldn't. She understood something most people didn't. People weren't starving for answers. They were starving to be heard. One Thursday afternoon, she visited the local high school to speak with a group of seniors. Not seniors like her, but high schoolers preparing for graduation. Many of them first-generation students. Some balancing part-time jobs. Others caring for younger siblings. A few already quietly grieving futures that felt out of reach. They were skeptical at first. What could this old woman know about them? Then she began to speak. I've seen war, she said. I've lived through blackouts, ration lines, bomb drills. I've buried a child. I've watched the world shift beneath my feet more times than I can count. But do you know what hurts more than any of that? Silence. They looked up. Being invisible. Being told without words that you no longer matter. A girl with green braids leaned forward. Margaret locked eyes with her. But you do matter. Even when the world forgets you. Even when you're not in the spotlight. Even when you think your voice is too small, you matter. A boy in the back wiped his eyes. And then, the girl with green braids raised her hand. Her voice trembled. Will it get better? Margaret didn't lie. Not always, she said. But you will get stronger. Afterward, the students stayed behind to talk. To hug her. To ask her to come back. She did. Week after week. And over time, Margaret began to feel something she hadn't felt since Tom passed. Needed. But it wasn't just schools. One day, her phone rang, and a gruff voice on the other end said, "You're the pizza lady, right?" Margaret hesitated. "I suppose I am." The man laughed. "Name's Gerald. I run the Eastbrook Senior Center. Heard about you. We need someone to shake things up. Someone who still has fire." Margaret chuckled. "You assume I still have fire?" "You made a pizza shop stop breathing," he said. "That's fire to me." She agreed to visit. The Eastbrook Center was old linoleum floors, flickering overhead lights, faded bulletin boards. But the people inside weren't faded at all. There was Ruth, who had once marched with Dr. King, and Donnie, who played trumpet in Harlem jazz clubs during the 60s, and Evelyn, who had survived breast cancer twice and still taught Tai Chi every Thursday. They didn't need pity. They needed space, respect, community. Margaret didn't come in with a plan. She came in with a question. What do you want to talk about? The answers were wide-ranging. Why the city cut our bus route. How no one teaches cursive anymore. How it feels when your own children forget to call. She listened, took notes, asked more questions. Within a month, Eastbrook had started a new series called The Living Library where, each week, one resident would share their life story with visitors, students, even city officials. People came, young and old, to listen, to ask, to understand. And it wasn't just storytelling. It was bridge building. The kind of connection that made teenagers stop scrolling their phones and start writing letters. That made council members rethink budget cuts. that made sons finally call their mothers. Margaret was always there, not as a leader, but as a witness. But even as things grew outward, Margaret found herself drawn inward. One night, sitting alone in her living room, a soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find a woman standing under the porch light. Mid-30s. Nervous. She wore a hoodie, her eyes red-rimmed. In her hands, she held a small Tupperware container. "Hi," the woman said. "You don't know me." I saw the video a few months ago." Margaret blinked, unsure what to say. "My name is Lacey," the woman added. "I live 2 blocks over. I've been clean for 9 months." Her voice broke. "I almost relapsed tonight." Margaret's eyes softened. "I was walking by," Lacey continued, "trying to clear my head, and I saw your light. And I thought, maybe she'll let me talk." Margaret stepped aside. "Come in, Lacey." They sat at the kitchen table. Lacey didn't eat the cookies she'd brought. She just talked. About foster homes. About losing her daughter to the system. About trying to rebuild. About how most nights were a coin flip between hope and self-destruction. Margaret didn't say much. When Lacey cried, she didn't interrupt. When Lacey cursed her past, she didn't correct. And when Lacey finally asked, "Do you think I'm worth saving?" Margaret reached across the table, took her hand, and whispered, "I think you already started saving yourself. You just needed someone to witness it." Lacey wept. She came back the next night, and the one after that. And soon, Margaret's house became something else. A quiet place of refuge. A table always set. A light always on. By winter, she was being called the Booth Lady by local kids. It started as a nickname on TikTok. Then it turned into something more affectionate. Respectful. An artist even painted a mural of her across the side of a community center wall. Margaret in mid-speech, hand on her heart, eyes fierce and kind. She blushed when she saw it. "They made me look 10 years younger," she joked. But she was proud, not of the fame, but of what it stood for. Because something was changing. In the city. In her. In people. The simple act of an old woman refusing to shrink had rippled outward in ways she'd never imagined. Then came the night it all nearly unraveled. She had just finished speaking at a college roundtable. The topic was ageism and empathy. She'd been eloquent, as always. But afterward, as she stepped outside into the bitter January wind, her knees buckled. She fell. Hard. 2 students rushed to help her. She was conscious, but pale. Her breath came in gasps. At the hospital, the doctor shook his head. "Your heart's tired, Mrs. Flynn. We need to slow things down." She was admitted for observation. 3 days. 3 long, quiet days. She stared at the ceiling a lot. Thought of Tom. Wondered if she'd pushed herself too far. On the second night, she whispered aloud, "Did I do too much, love?" No answer. But in the morning, when the nurse came in, she held a stack of envelopes. "Mail," she said, smiling. "You're quite popular." There were dozens of them. Cards from students. Letters from strangers. Crayon drawings from children. Notes from elderly women who'd watched her videos and decided to speak up for themselves for the first time in years. One stood out. It was from Jason. "You changed my life. Please rest. We still need you. But we need you well." Margaret cried. Not from pain, but from gratitude. She wasn't done. Not yet. But she had to be wise. She had to be steady. She had to live if she wanted the message to keep living through her. And so she rested. And when she was strong enough, she stood again. Winter gave way to spring. The city thawed, the trees began to bloom, and Margaret Flynn returned not to the spotlight, but to the rhythm of her mission. She moved more slowly now, carefully, but every step was deliberate. Her doctor's warning echoed in her mind. "Listen to your body. You have more to say, but only if you give yourself the time to say it." She did. Instead of traveling across the city, Margaret invited people to her home. Her living room became a place where stories bloomed. Teenagers with broken homes. Elders with forgotten dreams. Mothers carrying more than they could speak aloud. Veterans. Artists. Teachers. Grievers. Survivors. One rule guided them all. No one here is invisible. On a warm April morning, Jason returned with news. He had been accepted into the city's youth advocacy internship. His grades had improved. He was even helping his mother take night classes. "I want to study social work," he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "Maybe work with teenagers. Maybe kids like me." Margaret smiled, so wide her eyes crinkled. "I told you," she said. "You were already becoming the man you needed to be." He looked down. "I still screw up." "We all do," she replied. "The trick is to fall forward." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I love you, Miss Flynn." She didn't blink. "I love you too, Jason." It was the first time she'd said it to someone in years. And it was the first time someone younger had told her that in even longer. In May, the Eastbrook Senior Center threw a celebration in her honor. They called it Voices Remembered. It was small, humble, just the way she liked it. Folding chairs, lemon bars, handwritten posters. Her former students came, some now grandparents themselves. They told stories, brought photos. One even brought a copy of a poem she'd written on his fifth-grade report card. At the end, Gerald handed her a microphone. "We don't want a speech," he said. "We want a memory." She thought for a moment, then said, softly, "Tom once told me, you don't have to be the loudest in the room to change it. You just have to be willing to stay in it." She paused. "I stayed in the room. And look what you did with it." They gave her a standing ovation. Margaret cried, not because of the applause, but because for the first time since losing Tom, she felt full again. Not just remembered, alive. But just as the days turned golden, a shadow returned. It came in the form of a letter, a legal-looking one, from the city. The Eastbrook Senior Center was slated for closure. Budget issues, reallocation, bureaucratic nonsense. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then placed it carefully on the table. She stared out the window for nearly an hour. Then she picked up the phone. She didn't call Calvin, or a politician, or a donor. She called Lacey. "I need you to gather the mothers," Margaret said. Then she called Jason. "I need the students." Then Evelyn. "Get the elders ready." And finally, she called Linda. "Let's make some noise." 3 weeks later, over 200 people gathered on the front steps of City Hall. Signs, songs, speeches. But it wasn't angry. It was dignified. One by one, people stepped forward and told their stories. Of what Eastbrook meant. Of the meals shared, the hands held, the memories kept alive. Of the friendships that made growing old less lonely. Jason spoke, his voice clear and confident. "This center didn't just save my grandma. It gave me a place to grow up." Lacey spoke next. "I got sober, and I stayed sober, because someone listened to me in that building. Don't take that away from the next girl like me." Even Ruth, in her wheelchair, raised a trembling fist and said, "I marched with Dr. King, and I'll march to keep my lunch and bingo." Laughter. Cheers. Then Margaret stepped forward. She didn't read from notes. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked the councilman in the eye and said, "This building is not a line item. It is the beating heart of our community. You can choose numbers, or you can choose people. But remember, this numbers don't vote. People do." It went viral. Again. The city reversed its decision 2 days later. That night, Margaret returned home exhausted. She collapsed gently into her armchair, removed her shoes, and sighed. A deep, long sigh. Not from pain. Not from weariness. From peace. On her coffee table sat a Laterno return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single line. "You remind me of my mother. Thank you for being her when the world forgot." No signature. She folded it and placed it next to Tom's photo. By summer, Margaret was back to walking slowly through the park in the mornings, greeting passers-by, some of whom now recognized her and smiled shyly. She never brought it up, never mentioned the videos or the speeches or the center. Instead, she asked about them. Their day, their burdens, their little victories. Sometimes, people sat next to her on the bench and talked for hours. strangers when they sat, family when they left. One day, a little girl with braids ran up and handed her a daisy. For the lady with the kind eyes, she said. Margaret held it gently in her palm. What's your name, sweetheart? Hope, the girl said. Margaret's lips curled into a smile. Of course it is. In August, she returned to the same pizza shop. It had changed. They'd installed new booths. A photo of Margaret now hung on the wall next to a small plaque that read, "Speak with kindness. Someone might be hurting quietly." Jason wasn't behind the counter anymore. He was there as a customer in his break from interning at a local youth shelter. He waved her over. "Miss Flynn," he beamed. "Your usual?" She nodded. They sat together, sharing a slice and a soda. Around them, the world buzzed as usual. But to Margaret, everything felt still, centered, right. As they finished their meal, Jason asked, "Do you think you've done what you came here to do?" She looked at him, at the walls, at the city outside, then answered softly, "I think I've just remembered who I always was." That night, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the light spilled gold across her kitchen floor, Margaret wrote one last letter. She didn't know where it would go. She only knew it needed to be said. To the one who feels invisible. I see you. I don't know your story yet, but I know you have one. You matter. Your pain matters. Your joy matters. Your voice matters. When the world turns away, turn towards someone else who's hurting. Find them. Sit with them. Ask questions. Listen more than you speak. Share your bread, your tears, your silence. You don't have to be loud. You just have to be present. And when you feel forgotten, remember this. Sometimes the smallest voices echo the longest. With all my heart. Margaret Flynn. She placed it in an envelope. And on the front, she wrote, "For whoever needs to believe again."